All right, everyone. In this lecture, we're going to talk about hierarchy and particularly font hierarchy. So hierarchy is basically organizing information so the viewer can easily find it, which is a big thing that we're going to do in both design and in illustration. One of the things to think about, which we've talked about quite a bit, is this idea of reading directions. So there's a few different ones. The big two are the F and the Z. We usually read from top to bottom, left to right. So you can see here it goes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we're just kind of scanning downwards. And in the Z pattern, that's the F pattern. So we kind of scan over, look down, scan over, look down, scan over. That's the F. With the Z pattern, you're basically scanning over, scanning across the entirety of the document until you find something that you're interested in, and then the Z pattern, again, going back from 3 to 4. So keeping these in mind, oftentimes the thing you're going to hit people with the most is in the one area in the upper left-hand corner, and people usually end in the lower right-hand corner. Okay? So how do we create hierarchy? You can do it through contrast, and that contrast can be a number of different things that are contrasting. Scale, weight, font, like difference of fonts, white space, and color. So here we're going to talk first about scale. This information here is really nothing. It's just a bunch of lorem ipsum, but I can pull out and make one size bigger, and that would basically say this is where you want to read. Kind of start in the middle here with the Morby item. Now if we bring the top section up and increase it to the same size, the lorem ipsum one, you can see that since that's up higher at the top, that one is going to be the first thing you go to. Then you'll go down to the Morby one. And then if we take this other Morby, the Morby Hendret, and make that bigger, we'll kind of do the lorem, it will be the first, then the morum rutrum is a subheading of that, and then the Morby Headright is the next in the big kind of information. So the bigger something is in scale, usually the more important it is. Let's talk about weight. So weight is basically the thickness or the amount of ink around the letter forms. So we can see here, if you look down at the bottom at the Donek Ulma, that one has the strongest and the highest amount of contrast. It's a bold, and that's the place your eye is going to be led to first. These other ones, the Morby and the lorem, are actually thinner, so there is contrast there, but we usually look at darker, higher contrast between the black and the white and go there first. Usually, excuse me. Usually, weight is done in concert with another thing like color or something. And we can also change the actual font themselves. So a good combination oftentimes is a serif, something that has little feet with a sans serif. All of this information, the body text is in a sans serif Helvetica New, and we've put in a Cooper Black. Once again, all of these are the same, so we're going from the lorem to the Morby to the Donek. And we can also change this through color. So if we bring in stuff like a higher, darker contrast, you can see the Morby is a little bit of a higher contrast than the Donek. You would look there first. You can also do this through the use of actual color, and so that would bring the information up closer. We usually see warmer colors as coming closer to us. So if we had a lighter color in blue, that's going to seem less important than the warmer ones. And oftentimes this is done by combining all of the different options, or some of them. So for instance, if we create that first lorem set up there, increasing the size, and then we can create a slightly smaller version for the Morby and the Donek, so those are subheadlines. Then we can bring in some color as well, and some weight. Another thing to think about is white space. So you can see the lorem ipsum, the P and the T from the ipsum and the sit are almost connecting. So you want to make sure with the excuse me, that you change the leading there. So letting is basically the line space between things. So here I'm going to space these out just a little bit with the letter space and then increase the line space between these. Same thing with the other ones. The Morbies, I'm going to get a little bit of space, and that gives you a little bit of breathing room. You want to make sure there's a little bit of space to hop from one to the other. So how do we incorporate this into our design? So one of the things you can talk about is creating a visual scale using a grid. So this is just from a magazine called Dwellings. And if you look, everything kind of seems like it's overall making kind of structured in a way, even though there are a lot of different horizontal and vertical pictures as well as the text. And there's also some difference in color. But if we look at the underlying shape of this, you can see that overall everything is falling within this 5-column grid on both sides. There's a few things like the two pictures to kind of balance are off of the grid just a little bit, breaking the grid. The one in the lower left hand is kind of breaking outside the grid, and the one in the lower right hand is kind of pulling in a little bit with the grid to balance things out. But overall, your eye has a nice hierarchy to follow down and can very easily wayfind from piece to piece using these grids. Now I'm going to talk about a few rules of thumb. These are ways to make sure that you keep everything kind of, they're kind of sort of best practices. I'm not saying you can't break them, but I would say follow all of these a little bit, follow all of them and then break one of them at a time so you really know what that is doing as opposed to breaking all of them. So the first is keeping your hierarchy to this idea of 3 levels. So for instance, doing the header, making that the largest, if we're doing from size, or the boldest, subheader just a little bit smaller, and then the body text, which is most of the information, excuse me, making that a little bit smaller. You can even break this up with white space so that you can have, this is a way of doing this so that we have this information up here, and then a little header, and then body text, and then same thing, we're using the same font size and header layers to work on this other side. You can see how that gives it a nice sense of kind of rhythm and balance within the piece. And we know the 2 sections of text that are important. The use white space, this section is lower, and then the image itself. So the eye can easily scan around to find things. Another thing to do to keep things consistent is to use a typographic scale. So you want to start with your body text because that is going to be usually the smallest amount of text or where the most amount of text that you're going to be reading. Then increase a specific percentage for both the subhead and the header. For instance, if you've got a 9-point body, then doubling it to 8-point and then tripling the 9-point to a 36 would give you a nice sense of scale. Use a font that has a design bold and italic. Avoid increasing the stroke or slanting letter forms to create your own. You might have to do this sometimes, but really using a font that has been created to be bolded is going to make a big difference. Here I've got Times New Roman, and we're going to bold the second-hand lines and italicize the third line. On the left-hand side is the actual fonts that Times New Roman is using. So you can see the bold in the Times New Roman and then the italics. On the right-hand side are ones where I've increased the stroke and I've tilted this. And while at first glance it might not seem very different, if you look at things like the thinness of the stroke of the N, it's consistent on the left-hand side from the top and middle one. The thinner strokes in Times New Roman are consistent for both the normal and the bold, whereas on the other side there is a thickness across the entire piece, so there's a little bit less delicacy in that, and the reading of it's going to seem a little bit more stilted. Even bigger is the tilting of the Times New Roman, where you can really see this is both in the serifs on like the N's and the M's. They don't kind of swoosh up. They just kind of stay where they are. So if you look at the one over on the right-hand side, it looks like it's kind of leaning and it might fall over. And if you look also at like the dot of the I in the actual one on the left is still a circle, whereas because I have kind of shifted over the Times New Roman and basically tilted it, the I, that dot is actually also kind of shifted over, and it looks more like an oval, which also doesn't look very good. So whenever you get the chance, try to use the actual weights that are and italics that are created for the font family. Here's some rules of thumb for white space. After your font, elements like X height and color, the density, need to be taken into account. So usually you can increase the size, and this will be done for you in InDesign by default, from 1.3 to 1.8 points for your leading. 1.5 is usually a good one to look at, and you can kind of go back and forth. And then we'll talk about combining different fonts in another lecture. I don't want to overwhelm you with all the type anatomy and stuff. Lastly, remember from a rule of thumb point of view, that 30-60-10 rule that we talked about previously, where we're kind of going in and making about 60% of the color be one color, another 30% another color, and then the last 10% kind of your highlight or your kind of accent color. That's a good way to kind of keep things together. And lastly, just take some time away from your design before revisiting it. Kind of walk away from it, close your eyes, get a little space, and come back to see how it looks and give it a fresh view. That's always really important. All right, I hope this has been helpful, and I'll talk to you later.